Hey guys, welcome back to Building a Website from Scratch series. This time we're going to talk a little bit about Flexbox and how that works in order to create layouts and grid systems. Now, I would highly suggest, I'm going to have a link to this website called Flexbox Froggy. I would suggest you press and pause on this video, going to that link and going through the exercises. I believe that these exercises will help you understand Flexbox a little bit better, and then you can come back to the video. If you choose to go through the video, that'll be fine as well. I just find that this is a really cute exercise that you can do so that you can actually figure out how to use Flexbox. It gives you some of the information for what Flexbox is, and then of course, it's a game, so you can play here and then flex and then here you move the froggy, and again you can go to the next exercise, and then it gets more complicated as you're going through. So again, I would suggest, if you can, try to go ahead and play this game. It's really fun. It's free for use, and I think it will give you a good understanding of what Flexbox is. I will also have another link to CSS Tricks website for a complete guide to Flexbox. This has all the different values that Flexbox has, and all the different attributes and properties that you can implement, and kind of graphics as well, so that you can see how they look. Again, gives you a little bit more of an overview explanation of Flexbox. And then here as well in the CSS articles, CSS tricks, you can also look for specific attributes. Like for example, one of the ones that we're going to look at is going to be flex. And then you click on it, and then, for example, here it gives you the description, it gives you information about how to use it, as well as it gives you sometimes an example, a little demo that you can actually resize, make bigger, smaller, whatever it may be. And again, it just gives you better information as far as what each one of the properties is, in case you want to read a little bit more. So again, I'll have a link to this below in the description, so that you can go through these exercises as well. So let's go ahead and do the following. What we're going to do is we're going to go to Visual Studio Code. We're going to open our File Explorer, and then we can right click, and then we can copy, and then we can paste. So we're creating a copy of the template, and let's go ahead and rename that. And we're going to call it something like Flexbox Learning. Okay. And here, what I'm going to do on the copy, make sure you have selected the copy, right? To avoid any issues, go ahead and close that template. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to remove everything within the body tag of our page. All right. So I'm going to remove all of everything inside of the body tag. Just remember, you have to have an opening body tag, a closing body tag, and right after that, you'll have the HTML body tag. So this will be a completely brand new page, nothing inside of it. We are still linking to our CSS that we have already done. And let's go ahead and change the title so that we don't mistake it. So we're going to say Flexbox Learning, Code Tech Talk, and then all right, let's go ahead and start creating some different elements here so that we can actually start learning how to use Flexbox. So up here on the URL, let's go ahead and call that to Flexbox Learning. All right, and like we've said before, this is a very empty page, nothing in there. But you can see in the title of the page, it says Flexbox Learning, as well as on the tab of the page as well. All right. So let me introduce you to a new element that we're going to create. This is going to be the Div Element. This is a container element. It's an empty element. It doesn't have a width or a height. So if we were to put this in the page and save it, just div, again, open, close, greater than, less than sign, div. It is not a self-closing tag. You see it has a beginning and an end. So let's go into the browser. If we right-click and inspect the element, and we click on the body, then refresh, we have this div element, and as you can see, it doesn't really have any size associated to it. See, it tells us that it's a block level element. It's the whole width of this window, but it has a 0 height, 0 padding, 0 border, and 0 margin. You can see that on the right hand side. So again, it's just like a container element where we're going to hold information in. In the past, I believe when we looked at the table video, I talked and mentioned that we used to use tables to create our layouts. We no longer do that. Now we use these elements called divs. So let me go ahead and close this here, and let's go ahead and we're going to give it a class of parent. Okay, and like a good parent is going to have children, so I'm going to call it div class of child, and let's go ahead and give it something else like child 1, and then of course we're going to close that and just put maybe like a header 1 in there. All right, now this parent is going to have 5 different children, so child 2, 3, 4, 5. And of course, we're going to change these class modifiers, and you'll see the reason why I'm doing that in the future, because we're actually going to be giving them specific sizes so that we can try different some of the different features within Flexbox. Okay. So I'm changing the heading 1, heading 2, heading 3. Sorry. 2, heading 3, heading 4, and actually the bottom one, because I didn't add any styles to the heading 5, I'm just going to keep it as a paragraph. All right, if we go to refresh the page, here you go. So we have the parent, we have all the different children, and then we have the elements right here. All right, and let's go ahead and say that this parent is friends with another parent, and they're going to be next to each other. And if you see, now we have our heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, heading 4, and then the paragraph. Same thing down here is an exact copy of it. So in order to, so why should we care about Flexbox? Flexbox is very interesting. In the past, in order to set up layouts, we used to have to float elements to either the left or the right, but that would cause that any other elements next to it would also float to the left or to the right. So we would have to clear that float, and we had to add more markup to create different layouts. Now, using Flexbox alone, now we have the possibility to create more complex two-dimensional layouts, vertical and horizontal, in a much simpler way. Now, with the flexibility of Flexbox, not to throw a pun in there, but with the flexibility of Flexbox, you have to be very careful of what you add and understand all the different properties and attributes. So this video, you might have to watch it a couple times to look at it, go through the Flexbox Froggy as well, and practice. Later on, I'm going to create a different graphics so that you can kind of play out and create some elements using Flexbox, some different components using Flexbox, and I think that will be very helpful. Once we actually go into create our navigation, we will actually use Flexbox there as well, and it'll be a lot more helpful to kind of see that, and that's why we're going through this process before going back to the template. So we have 2 parents here, and each one of them have children. In Flexbox, you only have parent-child relationship. There is no such thing as grandkids or grandparents. In other words, the container and the item level are the only ones that are being affected. If this is a Flexbox, this parent class is a Flexbox element, then this child will be affected. However, this H1 will not. In order for this H1 to be affected using Flexbox, then we will have to declare this child to be a parent of this H1 as well. So the classes and effects, the properties and attributes that you add to the class of parent will not affect the H1 element or anything within this child, okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Let's go to the bottom of our CSS. And this one, we later on might disable it or comment it out. I just wanted to have it here so that you can have just information about how to use Flexbox. And then once we start creating our grid system, then you can use it as a reference as well. So let's go ahead and type in here, Flexbox learning. And then, of course, end of Flexbox learning. Hopefully you have gone back to your code and kind of revised things and look at everything that you've written, and you'll see that how much helpful it is to have comments in your content, especially as you're developing. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to select our parent. And the next thing we need to do is select our child. We'll add all the other children classes like child 1, child 2, child 3, child 4, child 5 right below this as well. Let's go ahead and do that. Child 1, and then child 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. So now we have this parent. To make it easier to see and differentiate these two parents, let's go ahead and give it a border of, like, say 3 pixels, solid, and then red. So we're going to do parent, border, 3 pixels, solid, red. If we look at it here, then you can see the borders of each one of the parents. Right? You should also be able to see that we're scrolling up and down because divs by default are block level elements. We talked a little bit about block level elements last video when we talked about the list items. So that's why. So even though they only have this H1 here, it holds as much information or try to occupy as much space as possible. So now, remember how we talked about in list items when we were doing the inline styles, we did something like display inline block. That defined that as an inline block element. We can do something very similar to our parent using Flexbox. We can do display Inline Flex. And if you look in here, we were to refresh the page, then you'll see that it'll turn this element as a Flexbox element first of all. And then what it also does is that makes it so if there's enough space, then lets the next element to float or go right next to that other element. So you have these two parents, see parent 1, parent 2. And as long as this has a lot of space or enough space, then it will allow this to kind of come back up. But for example, what happens if I were to put this paragraph here? And we're going to get rid of it too in a little bit. Again, let's go to view, toggle word wrap. All right, if we come back here and we refresh this, because this now has a lot of content inside of it, it no longer can float or go to the element right above it because, again, of the quantity of the content, okay? So now let's go ahead and kill that, revert that back. If there's a space, then it'll float next to the other element. If not, then it'll go and occupy as much space as it needs. Here you can see this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Save that, refresh it. See, it pushes that element all the way as much as this content here, needs that space. It's going to occupy that. All right. So I just wanted to show you that Flexbox also allows for inline flex to allow for other elements to float inside of it. What we're next to them, what we're going to do is we're just going to say flex. And flex, again, it'll try to use as much space as possible, but you'll notice something different. Let's go ahead and erase this display flex. Save the CSS, come back to the URL, to the browser, and then you'll see that when we did that, look at how it normally displays. It has a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right, from top to bottom. And each one of these elements, if we right click here, you'll see that these child 1 occupies a full row, child 2 occupies a full row, child 3 occupies same thing for child 5. Now look at what happens when we re-add display flex. What's going to happen is that it will now force these elements to go next to each other. And then each one of these children, look at the height of each one of them is the same height as its parent. So by just adding display flex, it automatically moves the elements to the left, right, of each other, and then or puts them in a row. And then it also occupies these the same height as the parent element. So for example, if we were to do something like a break here and add a paragraph of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So when we refresh, then you'll see down here that this child 1 has this paragraph and the heading 1. And then if you go to child 2, it still expands or stretches to the very bottom to kind of occupy the same height as the tallest element. All right. Just to avoid confusion, let me go ahead and I am going to kill the second parent here, remove it, and we're just going to work with this one parent child set. All right. Now, so that we can play a little bit better, let's go ahead and add a few more styles to our parent element. So we're going to give it a width of 100, view width, again, the browser width, 100%, and then a height of 100 view height. So the browser's height, 100%. Again, this portion right here. If we refresh this, then you'll see that this red border all around the browser goes from the very top to the very bottom. All right. So then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, if we refresh this or inspect this, then you'll see that the children also adapt to the parent's height. Look at that. It doesn't matter how big we make it or how small we make it, it's going to try to adapt. Okay. If we make it too small, then you can see the scroll bars right there. All right. So now let's go ahead and close this inspect view here. And now we've actually declared our parent to be a flex element. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is, and we're going to play with, is going to be the flex direction. So here's what's interesting. Flex direction, let's go ahead and set it up to be row first. Now, the flex direction allows us to be able to determine what the direction of the content or how the content is going to flow on the page. If we set it up as row, nothing changed, because for row, what's happening is that the direction is from the top left corner right here that I'm pointing to with my mouse to the right and from top to bottom. Again, pay attention. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Flex direction, if we set it up as row, is going to be from the top left corner to the right. That's our main axis. And our secondary axis is from top to bottom. Now, we also have row reverse. If we look at this, before I refresh it, if row, right, is from left to right as our main direction, our main axis, and top to bottom as our secondary axis, look at what happens when we refresh. Now, it reverted the row. So now our direction is from right to left and still top to bottom. Do you see that? Right to left, top to bottom. It changed the order of how the elements are displayed on the page. Now you have the heading 1 on the right, where when we had a row, it was on the left. Same thing for 2, 3, 4, 5. It doesn't mean that it flipped it, because it's not it's not a mirror image. It's just a reordering of the elements. Now, instead of being from right to left, is now from left to right, is now from right to left. And again, still top to bottom. Now, we also have this other property called, non-property attribute called column. Now, this column attribute looks very similar to the row, but it changes its axis. So from now, we set up column is from top to bottom as our main axis, and then left to right. You see that? Top to bottom, and then left to right. Let's go ahead and change that column to row once again. See that? That's row. That's column. Again, our main axis, you have to, when you're working with Flex, you have to think about what the main axis and secondary axis are. So when we're talking about row, when we're talking about Flex direction column, our main axis is from top to bottom, left to right. Now let's go ahead and we have a row reverse. So now let's go ahead and do a column reverse. If we look at the column reverse and we refresh it, I would like for you to take a guess. Where would the direction be? What's the main axis and what's the secondary axis? So the main axis is now going from bottom to top, right? And then still from left to right. Notice bottom to top, left to right. And you see that it changes the order of the different elements inside of it, or the children element, without having to change our markup. If we look at the markup, we still have our child 1, child 2, child 3, child 4, child 5 in the same order. We don't have to change any of the orders of the children element in order to show this way. For the most part, you would actually see a lot. The most common thing that you will see is probably something like row, where you have them this way. Now, hopefully this is making sense. Again, you have a primary axis and secondary axis. Now, as much as we have styles for our parent elements, we also have styles for our children element. Now, one of the things that we need to be aware of here is that we need to allow for the children to be able to grow or expand or reduce size based on whatever axis it's working on. So we cannot say width or height, because if we change from row to column, then the primary axis changes. So what we need to do is we need to focus on styles that would allow, based on the axis that we're working on, to allow the element to have a specific width or whatever it may be. So in this case, let's take a look at this. Let's go ahead and do the following. For our children element, let's go ahead and give it a border of 3 pixels solid, and let's go ahead and say something like lime green, just so that it pops up. All right. Now you can see that we have each one of our children elements, and let's go ahead and switch that again. Let's go ahead and play with our row. Let's go ahead and change it to row reverse. Save that, and you can see how it changed in order. We can do column, and now you can see how the columns are arranged, and then we can do column reverse as well. And then you can see how the column or the element, children elements, are set up. All right. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and revert that back to row. And you'll notice that in row, again, our main axis is from left to right. Okay. What if we wanted each one of these elements to have a specific, in this case, width? Let's go ahead and do that. What we're going to do, our assign for our child, is something called flex-basis. That's our property for our basic width or dynamic size for these elements. So in this case, let's go ahead and do something like 20 EM, just to test this out. Flex-basis, colon, 20 EM, semicolon. When we refresh it, now you see that these are going to be next to each other. All right. Now we're defining a specific width here, in this case, for each one of these elements. Now, look at this. They seem all to be in the same equal size, right? Where before they were kind of next to each other based on the width of the content. Now let's take a look at the following. Let's go ahead and change flex direction to column instead. And now you notice that they also have a 20 pixel width, a 20 EM width, except for the number 1 because that one requires more space. So the other one's kind of adjusted, right? Based on that, on the other space that it's available. So if you notice, these are very close to each other. Now, again, let's go back to row. We're going to be switching back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, so that you can see how each one of the properties and the parent properties and children properties, or container and item properties, all play with each other. So now, what if one content, maybe something else needed a little bit more extra content or extra width, right? So let's go ahead and to each one of our children, let's go ahead and add it. So something like flex grow, and let's go ahead and give it a value, all right? You'll see what's going to happen. So in flex grow, we're going to have flex grow 1. We're going to change that to 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. See, 3, 4, 5. All right. All right. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to, let's take a look in here so that I can actually start doing this. All right. Very good. Very good. And then here we're also going to add something like flex shrink. And I'll explain this in just a little bit. So we're going to do the same thing here. Flex shrink, flex grow. 3, 4, 5. And when we refresh it, hopefully you notice that subtle jumped. All right. You see that number 1, right, is bigger. Number 2 is smaller, 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 and smallest, right? And then based on the size, you see how as we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller, these 5 kind of almost disappears. So what's happening with flex grow and flex shrink? Flex grow allows each child to be able to grow whatever amount we have determined. So for example, in this value here, we have determined for this to grow 1 more time or 1 times more than the available width that we have available, as long as is, so for example, each one of these children has a basic size of width or growth element size of 20 EM. Okay, that's its basic size. If it has more space, say for example, our browser window was more than, say it was 200 EMs, right? So we'll have more than enough time for this to, more enough space to accommodate just for the 20 EM. What's going to happen is that it's going, depending on the flex grow of each child element, it's going to take that space and allow that to grow for that multiple of sizes. So for example, say child 2, right? The second child has 2 times more the space that it could use to grow compared to the first child. Child 3 has 3 times more space to grow into than the first child. Child 4 has 4 times more space to grow than the first child. Same thing for child 5. Now, shrink works the same way by backwards. Again, remember, we have a minimum width that we want to try to keep of 20 EM. If that 20 EM, say for example, our browser is only, say for example, 80 EM, what's going to happen is that it's going to try to shrink all the other elements so that it can try to fit as much, the content as much as it can possibly do. So what's going to happen is that child 2 is going to try to shrink 2 times more, or will be compressed 2 times more than the first child. Child 3 will try to be compressed more than 3 times more than child 1. Same thing for child 4 and child 5. That's why you see it here. Even though child 5 has a grow of 5, it has a shrink of 5 as well. So because we're allowing this to shrink more, that's why it looks that much smaller, because the browser currently doesn't have the space to accommodate for this 100 EM that we have set in place here. Hopefully you see that, and that's why you see that being smaller. As we're getting, for example, if we were to change this to 10 EM, then you'll notice that we have more than enough space. And as you see, I'm actually scrolling in and out with the wheel of my mouse. That's how I'm able to kind of zoom in and zoom out. So here you can see that, for example, let's go ahead and change that even smaller to 5 EM. Now that we have that, now you can see, for example, child 1 can only grow up to 1 times more. This can grow 2 times more, so it has a little more space, right? This empty space here is more than the empty space that is allowed for child 1. Same thing for child 3, 4, and 5, and that's why 5 looks a lot bigger or wider than child 1. If we were to change this, sorry, I jumped very far, to column, then you'll notice here, again, we're still using this 1, mainly because of the margin, it's looking that way. Let's go ahead and change that to to paragraph instead. And you'll see now that this is larger, second largest, third largest, fourth largest, and then that will be the smallest one available. So that's why you're able to see these different sizes kind of adjusting to each other. And that's why I meant it's not only a width or height, because again, in a row, it's from left to right, right? Or in that x-axis, that's our primary axis. And the secondary axis is our y-axis. In columns, our primary axis is the y-axis, and the secondary axis is the x-axis. That's why you see the change here. And again, biggest, smaller, smallest, right? And again, if we change that back to row, again, it reflects the same way right here. Okay, so it's not just based on the width or the height, it's based on whatever axis it allows that element to expand or to shrink. Okay, so let's go switch that back to H1. We can have that there. And just like what we did with border, hopefully by now you're so familiar with using border, understand that this is border width, border style, and border color. We have a way to do the same thing here for our children elements. So here what we can do is, let's go ahead and do the following. Let's see if we can, no, let's not do that. I am trying to break them apart into individual lines so that I can show you what we're trying to do here. Okay. All right. So now we have our flex bases set up here. Let's go ahead and comment that out because we're not going to use it. By the way, little neat shortcut here. If you want to comment something on Visual Studio, you can do Control / on your keyboard. I believe maybe on Macs is Command / You can try that out, and that should let you comment out. If you have a chunk of code that you want to comment out, you can do that as well. Just select it and do that rather than having to write individual code or lines. So what we're going to do inside of each one of our children, we can also use this property called Flex. Flex accepts 3 different parameters, all right? So what it does is that it accepts the first parameter is our flex grow, the second parameter is our flex shrink, and our last parameter is our flex basis. So using that, we can simplify instead of having 3 different lines for each one of our elements, kind of like what we have here set up in place. What this can do is just help us simplify that into one single line. So let's go ahead and we're going to change this as well to 2 and 2. 3 and 3. And I would also suggest, as you're working on this, go ahead and at any point, feel free to take a break and then just go ahead and change numbers. See how they look for you. See what would happen if we do, for example, instead of a flex grow of 5, a flex grow of 1 in here. And now you can see, for example, in this case, this is the same size as these other elements. And again, second biggest, third biggest, and the biggest of the elements that we have available. So again, and you can do the same thing if you were to change the other values. You can change the flex basics, flex shrink for individual elements, and then you can see how that actually works for you. So again, now we have worked already on 2 different styles or 2 different properties. We have flex direction row, and then we have our flex, which is our flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, which is applied to our children element. This flex element here, notice it's only applied to the child element. It's not applied to its parent. For the parent, if it doesn't have another parent that is flex, then you will have to use something like width or height, like the way that we're doing it here. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions, leave them in the comments below. So now, what's happening here? Let's go ahead and do something else. I remember something else that I wanted to share with you guys. If you pay attention, I'm using specific units here, even though these are units that are flexible. I want to show you something here. What happens if we change this to something like 25%? If we change this to 25%, what's happening here? 25 plus 25 plus 25 plus 25, that's 100, plus 25 is 125. Why is this element still up here? And best of all, even though we have flex grow and flex shrink, these are no longer being affected by those values. If you use something like percentages, then the flex grow and flex shrink might not necessarily work for you because, again, you're using a percentage of whatever parent container you have on. However, again, 25 plus 25, 50 plus 25, 75 plus 25, 100 plus 25, 125. If we were to do our math correctly, then this number 5 should be going to the next line, correct? Let's go ahead and take a look at what's happening. This is an introduction to another variable that another property that we haven't looked at yet. So under flex direction, this is a parent property. We're going to say flex wrap, and the first value we're going to look at is no wrap. So flex wrap, when we refresh a no wrap with an attribute of no wrap, then it actually does what it's telling you that it's doing. It's allowing the content to, even though it's growing outside of whatever parent container, it's allowing it not to wrap around it, not to move this element to the one below. We can do this crazy thing here, and you can see it. If you want to copy it, you can copy and try it as well. But take a look at this. I just added another area here, and now because it's using 25%, now because it doesn't have a lot of space to even simulate that 25%, is making these changes where, again, it is taking into account our flex grow and flex shrink. Again, when it works with percentages, you have to test those out to make sure that it's working as you wanted it to work. You might see it a little bit differently, and again, you might experience some issues with it. But here we go. So we have this here, right? Now we're talking about 250% of the full container. Well, how can we fix that? Well, if we go back to our CSS, I'm going to remove the different divs that I just added. And if we go back to the CSS and change flex wrap to just wrap and refresh it, now look at what happened. It allowed for each one of these elements to occupy 25%, and then this bottom child is occupying actually 100%. Let's make this a little bit bigger, something like 10 pixels so that we can see it better. You can see this right down here all around because we did allow it to grow. What we're saying is because it does have enough space to grow, then go ahead and grow as much as you need to grow so that you can fit that space. Again, if we were going to go ahead and copy this over, then you'll see how it starts playing with it again. Again, you have 25, 25, 25, 25, which is 100, another 100%. And because now we have two elements down here, then you now have 50 and 50% to occupy that space. But not so, because this one has a little bit more grow than this one over here. Then what's happening is that this one is occupying a little bit more space. Now let's do the following. Let's go in the CSS and change our grow to be just 1 for our child 4 and 1 for the child 5. If we refresh that, then it will occupy the same space for both sides. Well, what would happen if we change it to 0, to the grow of 0? Well, let's take a look at that. Hopefully you understood what just happened, because we're not allowing the elements to grow and we're just allowing it to use the basic width or the basic sizing of 25%, then it's only going to occupy 25%. All right. Again, if you allow the flex grow to be 0, then it won't grow. Same thing for flex shrink. If you set it up to 0, then it won't shrink. It would only use whatever unit you have used for your flex basis, which in this case is 25%. So let's go ahead and refresh that, change that back to the values that we had, refresh it, and again, we have the layout that we have here, which if you just look at this is really great. By looking at it, you already kind of have a grid system in place. 4 columns on each one of them, right? And then you have whatever elements you have down here. If we wanted them to be standardized, then we would make them all grow 1 and shrink 1 or whatever it may be, right? So take a look at this. And we kind of have already our kind of little grid system started, but we're not going to create it right now. This is just for Flexbox purposes. So let's go ahead and refresh this. And now we have all of our elements here. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to also look at this CSS, and we have now our flex direction and flex wrap. Right? Just like what we did with flex down here, we're also able to combine these two in a single property and an attribute as well. So what we can do is we can do flex flow row wrap. I'm going to comment these out and save this. And again, the first value is going to be our flex direction, and our second value is going to be our flex wrap. If we refresh the browser, then again, everything remains the same. Here we can also say column wrap, and here again, 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%, and because we're allowing it to grow, this grew 100%. Remember, top to bottom, left to right. Primary axis is the y-axis from top to bottom, and the secondary axis is the left to right, so the x-axis from left to right. Same thing if we were to change that to column reverse. Our primary axis is still the y-axis, but it's now from bottom to top, and the secondary axis is still from left to right. All right, hopefully you can see that there. And again, we're going to revert that back to row. Now that we have this, we have worked on these elements. Now we have set up children spacing, right? Or sizing, and we have set up the direction. We understand the direction of the elements and wrapping around them. Now the next thing that we can do is we're going to go ahead and align our elements. So we can align our items using our parent as the indicator. So we're going to say something like align items. That's going to be our property. And the first one, we're just going to say we're going to use flex start. We're going to start from the beginning. So align items is our property, and an attribute value is going to be flex start. So if we go over here, we refresh, look at what just happened. Before, these were stretching, correct, to try to fit as much space as possible. But now these are actually all kind of pushing towards the top. Again, remember, our primary axis when we're using row is our x-axis from left to right. Our secondary axis is from top to bottom, or our y-axis, right? So align items affects our secondary axis. Let's go ahead and try that by switching instead of row to column. Again, here we go. Column, our primary axis is top to bottom, and then our secondary axis is left to right. Because left is a starting point, that's why we have flex start to the left. Now, there's also, if you have a flex start, then you also have a flex end. And when you refresh this, again, it pushes the elements to the end, to the right. If we do that to our row, flex flow row wrap, then again, instead of pushing it to the top, it pushes it to the bottom. Again, when you're looking at row, your primary axis, your secondary axis is your y-axis from top to bottom. So the top is your start, the bottom is your end. You also have other attributes as well, like for example, center. It allows you to center the elements here. And let me do something different. Let's go ahead and change this instead of 25%, because I would like for them to be in a single row, and I'll explain later why. Let's go ahead and change our children element to be 20% so that they are all in a row, right? It makes it a little bit easier to see. So if we go here against flex start, see they move them all to the top. Flex end, it moves them all to the bottom. Center, it moves them all to the middle, again, of the secondary axis. Remember, align items affects secondary axis, not primary axis. All right. And then, for example, we also have this one that you are familiar with, which is stretch, which is the default value. You'll see that stretch goes from the top to the very bottom. It stretches the element as much as it can possibly do, right? And then the last one that you have is this one called baseline. In typography, baseline aligns the one line to the next line in separate columns or paragraphs. So you'll see that in play here. If we have align items baseline and you refresh this, now you'll notice it'll look a little bit weird, but what's happening is aligning the baseline of the heading 1 to the baseline of the heading 2 to the baseline of the heading 3, 4, and the paragraph of 5. If we were to draw an invisible line right here, let me see, how do I do that? Let's take a screenshot, for example, here. And we do this screenshot right here. then you'll see that all of those elements are aligned to the baselines of the elements next to it. This is really great, especially when you're trying to do like 2 paragraphs in 2 different columns, or maybe you have a main navigation and a sidebar that also has a lot of text. That's one way that you can use so that they are aligned next to each other. All right, so just quick pro tip here. All right, so now that we've done that, now we play with align items, and we have here baseline. And let's go ahead and change that to flex start. Okay, just pushing all the elements to the very top. Now this is using wrap, right? What happens, there's another value for our flex wrap called wrap reverse. If we use wrap reverse and we refresh the browser, what just happened? Think about it. If wrap allows you to wrap the elements, and again, the flow goes from top to bottom because we're using row. Remember, we're using row, right? And we're using wrap, so we're allowing from top to bottom to align to the next line. If we do wrap reverse, then what it's going to do is going to allow the content to wrap from the bottom to the top. What this will do is, again, if you have content, then it'll occupy more of the space on the bottom of the element rather than on the top. You can see that done in some graphics where you might have a background image and then the text kind of comes from below. You are able to add some of those styles based using kind of this flex wrap reverse. Again, this part of wrap reverse is not something that I use very often, but I wanted to show you how that's done. Now, the reason why I waited a little bit is because if we have stretch, it doesn't work that way, right? So I wanted to explain why and how you're able to use wrap reverse and how that works in the real world as you're creating these layouts. So again, wrap reverse exists. I don't use it as much. I've only used it for this example, and that's the only thing that I've used it for. So just giving you a little bit of context of how much I use it, but that doesn't mean that other better developers are not using that. All right, so now we've already talked about flex direction, flex wrap, we've talked about flex basics, grow, shrink, flex flow, flex for the children element, and we have done align items as well. Now the next thing that we're going to do is we're also going to now work on our primary axis. So we're going to do justify content. And in justify content, we're going to do flex start. Now, we're going to go here, refresh, because all of these are so close to each other, it's hard to see. So what I am going to do, I am going to delete all of these. If you want to, you can move those comments outside so that it makes it easier for you to see or to keep it as as notes. What I'm going to do is I am going to comment this out, and here I'm going to do flex 0, 0, and 33%. And let's go do 30%. Again, I don't want it to grow anything. I don't want it to shrink at all. I only wanted to have a width or an expansion of 30%. So when we refresh this, now you see we have 30, 30, 30, 30, 30. And again, we could do even like something like 27 or 26%. So that way you can see a little bit more of the jump of the content. Now, if you look at this, justify content flex start. We're on our flex flow of row wrap, or right, the flex direction is row. So the primary axis is the x-axis, which is up here from left to right, and our secondary axis is top to bottom. Align items affects individual items or children elements when they're in a single row on our secondary axis. Justify content affects elements from left to right or our primary axis. So if you notice, we have flex start. We also have flex end. Again, before refreshing, hopefully now you've understood that because this is our start, then our end is going to be right there. Again, it's moving it based on the axis that we're on, the primary axis that we are on, left to right. Again, here we can do center. And again, that centers it on the page here, right? And let's go ahead and change this real quick because I want to do something here. 10%. Okay, so we have 5 different elements, so 50% of the screen is on the center single row. So we have center. Check what happens when we have a specific width and height for our parent, and then we set up our align items to be center and justify content to be center. Then its center aligns that element within its parent element or parent content. All right. Hopefully you guys see that. Let's go ahead and refresh that. We're going to do flex start so that it pushes it to the top. And again, we have justify content. We have flex start, flex end, and center, which is very similar to what we had on align items. Now, here's where it gets super interesting. We can also do space between. If we do space between and refresh this, check out what happens. It pushes all the different elements and it creates the same gap between each one of these elements. So it creates the gap between the elements that we have, the children elements inside of the parent elements. So it pushes and spreads them apart with an equidistant space. Okay, so now let's go ahead and change that again back to flex start. And I'll explain what happens. You see this gap right here that I'm moving with my mouse, it's taking that and divided it by the spaces that it has to fill in that gap in, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it takes this whole space right here from in the main axis and divides it by 4. So it allows that to create that gap, a space between for each one of those different spaces. Now, we also have something called space around. Now, space around does the same thing, but instead of dividing it by 4, it divides it by 6, because now you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But it actually divides it by, not by 6, it divides it by the sides of the children elements. So, for example, each one of these squares has 2 sides next to it. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? 5 children, 10 sides. So what it does is it divides it by 10 so that it gives it one space here, another space here, right to the middle, the midline between 1 and 2, and then it gives it the same space down here and the same space in these other sides here. That's why if you notice on your screen or in the video that you're watching, we have this gap right here on the left. It's half the gap that you have down here. So that's why that is happening. Now, to solve that, there's also another attribute called space evenly. And if we refresh this, now what that's doing is now it is dividing it by 6. So it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This gap right here, this gap right here, this gap right here are all the same size. So without having to do math, without having to move elements around or to kind of try to get one pixel, another pixel, changes like that, this is done automatically for you. Imagine if we now change this to say 15%, automatically CSS calculates that space for you to create those gaps for you. Automatically. You don't have to do anything to make that happen. Now that's using justify content. So now let's go ahead and change that and let's go ahead and do flex start. All right. So now we have these different elements. Now, what happens when we had, for example, something like the 30%, 26% that we had before, right? You have two different rows here, right? When you have a single line, align items can control the difference and move all the elements together. But what happens when you have multi-line, like what you have here? What's happening is that we need to add another property called align content. And here we can do something like flex start. When we do align content and use flex start, look at what happens with this grouping. It puts it all together. You can see that also here in the complete guide to Flexbox. You'll see that when we go to align content, see align items when there's a single line here. And then when you have align content is when you have more than a single line, then it groups them together and moves them as a whole. So now if we go here, if we do flex end, because our align items, remember, align items work on the secondary axis, so does align content. Align content also works on the secondary axis. So let's go ahead and do flex end. And now it moves it to the bottom. What happens if we change it to column instead of row? Same thing. It moves it to the right because that's our secondary axis. In column, our primary axis is our y-axis from top to bottom. Our secondary axis is from left to right. Remember, when working with Flexbox, understanding what your primary and secondary axes are going to be your very, very best friends here. All right, so you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, let's go ahead and change that to, again, row, because it's easier to see. We also can do here center. Right there. If you know that you have more than one line, then you can use align content, and here you can use center and center, and then it will align all the elements within the center of the page. Align content though has more attributes than align items. We've already seen align items. It has flex, start, flex, and center, stretch, and baseline. Now, align content also has stretch, and see what it does? It stretches the elements separately or as a group. If you wanted it to stretch, kind of like what we had before, then you will have to do align items stretch as well, and that will make the boxes to grow. Okay, again, think about it. When you're looking at align content, it works on it as a whole rather than individual items. Think about it as a group versus individual, okay? So also besides stretch, you also have some of the same elements, spaces that you have in justify content, like space around. Look what it does. Space between, which pushes them from top to bottom, right here. And also space evenly. And then it allows for the spaces to happen there as well. So those are the different values that you have for align content. And here again, we can do flex start so that everything is kind of all the way to the top and to the primary starting point. I would suggest pausing the video and then going over all the different values that you have for flex flow and then trying them, like align items, justify content, align content, and change the flex direction for each one of those. Seeing what happens when you do row reverse, column reverse, and that try to experiment and have a feel and understand where your primary axis is, what your secondary axis is, all right, or your main axis or secondary axis are. Now, the next thing that we're going to do, here you have these elements right there. Now we're going to focus on a couple more properties that you can add to the children element. So the first one is going to be, let's take a look at, say for example, let's go ahead and do the child 5. Child 5, and I'm just starting another one just because it's easier. I don't want to uncomment any of these down here, or I think I can. Let's go ahead and test it out. That's the beauty of coding while you're teaching. All right, here you go. Let's go ahead and change that. Okay, that's fine. We can keep it about 20%. And let's go ahead on child 5. Let's do align self. And in align self, let's go ahead and do flex start, which is not going to change anything because this align item right here already has flex start. Now let's see what happens when we do flex end. Look at what just happened. Because we are allowing this right here, right, to change by itself, then we're just allowing this alignment for this child number 5 to change individually compared to the rest. So we're overriding our align items with align self for that specific child. You can see it more drastically if we were to change this, for example, to stretch. All right, we have stretch there, and let's go ahead and align content. Let's go ahead and do stretch as well so that we can see that. All right, take a look at this. Now this is stretch all the way from top to bottom, but this one now, 5, is not only to the very bottom, which is flex end. Here we can do flex start, and it does that. We can also do baseline, which here is harder to see because it's trying to get the baseline of these other elements. So let's go ahead and change that maybe. Let's go ahead and do center here. And let's do center here. So now you can see that it's aligned to the baseline of these other elements here. All right, the bottom part of this number 5. You also will have here, you will also have stretch. You can stretch the element, the element right here, or the child element. And then you can also do, we did flex start, flex end, center, stretch, and baseline. So those are the ones that you'll be able to use to override that whatever assignments you have. So flex and here, the assignments you have for this specific child. Again, this align self overrides your align items. It does not override your align content, and that's why here you notice that it only contains within this grouping right here. All right, so just wanted to show you that that's possible in case you wanted to change that at any point. Let's go ahead and do something else and go ahead and change this back to flex start so we can have these all the way to the top. The last property that I want to show you guys for the children element is going to be order. So pay close attention. We're going to add it to the child 3. We're going to add the property of order, colon, and let's go ahead and do something like -1. Okay, and let's go ahead and do in child 1, change the order to 1. Okay, now let's see what happens. We refresh it. What just happened? Notice that the number 3 child got moved to the first position, and the number 1 child got moved to the last position. Look at this. Child 1 has an order value of 1. Child 3 has an order value of -1. So in order to do that, you have to use integers, either positive or negative, but they have to be whole numbers. The default value for order is 0. That's why these 3 elements did not move, because again, -1, 0, 0, 0, and then +1. And you can go positive to infinity and negative to infinity if you have a lot of elements that you want to rearrange. But by just changing that, by just changing the order of the elements, you can change how a layout looks without having to change your markup. Again, you can change the order of how elements display on the page without having to change your markup. Again, order, very, very, very important. Again, it goes from negative infinity to positive infinity, with 0 being the default value. If we were to refresh this and remove, say, for example, our child 1, and add that and remove that 1, and how about to maybe child 5? We do order of -2. Just so that you can see it, and we refresh. Now, because -2 is lesser than -1, if you think about an order line, right, you have the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, you have the -1, -2, -3, -4. It will arrange the items or the children based on the order that you give it. Again, this just alternates orders rather than or alternates the position of how the elements get rendered on the page. All right. All right. So now doing that, take a look at the page. Now we have completed talking about all the different properties and attributes that we have for Flexbox. We learned about flex direction. We learned about flex wrap, flex flow. We talked about also about flex bases, flex grow, flex shrink, or the compile value, which is flex. We used align items, align content, align justify content, align self, and order. Some of them, again, are going to be parent elements. Some other ones are going to be children and children properties. So if we look at this here, let's go ahead and do the following on here. We have a child 1, right? And then here, let's go ahead and inside of our child 1, let's go ahead and add a div called with a class of, say, title, and a div with a class of description, and a div with a class of image. All right. And what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to do the image on the very top right here. Perfect. So let's go ahead and add an image there. One good place where you can find images is going to be pexels.com. It's free for use. They have available images that you can use. They're open credit, and if you want to, you're able to give the photographers a referral and kind of let them know where you got the picture from. But these are really good, so you can use commercially as well if you need to. So let's go ahead and get one of these images here. Let me go ahead and get this image here. I'm gonna go ahead and copy link location. Go to my image over here and go ahead and add an image, and then add a source, and then add that URL. I'm going to remove all this stuff towards the end because that one is just what they use to be able to kind of trim the picture so it doesn't look so big. And then here, of course, we're going to use our alt tag. I'm not sure if we've talked about this in the past, or I don't think we have used images yet. So let me explain this. Image of a circuit. All right, so this is our image tag. Our image tag takes different values, so we can add classes to it as well, but the two primary ones that you can use is going to be source. If this looks a little bit familiar, it's because it's the same as what we use for our, we haven't used that yet. It's going to be what we're going to use for our JavaScript whenever we start adding JavaScript to the site. All right, so what we're going to do here, let me make sure, all right, everything's good. Let me go ahead and close that up. So image, this is the image tag. It's a self-closing tag. It uses the source where we actually put the URL, or later on when we start working on it, we actually have an image folder, and inside of that image folder, we're also going to add images there, and then we'll be able to link them here. So this is what's called a static path, so that we can use directly to a website, link it to a website. And then alt tag, this is in case that image doesn't display on the page, this will display on the page and give a little bit description, especially for people who are visually impaired. So let's go ahead and let me save this. Let's go back to our test here, refresh, and then look at what happened. This image is blowing it up, but see, that's the image that we're using. But what happens if I remove that G at the end? It's not going to be able to find it. So if I refresh it, you can see this word image of a circuit is the same as this right here. In case that image for some reason gets removed or something happens, then this will work as a save file or fallback to be able to find or describe what that picture is. So usually I try to be as descriptive as I can on all tags, especially for people who are visually impaired. If anybody is using a screen reader, then at least they'll be able to experience or have the same experience as somebody that is able to see the image, and they'll be able to see, okay, this is an image of a circuit, and I can provide them more information if I knew more about that image. So let's go ahead and save this, refresh this, and let's go ahead and add a style for this for all of our images. So going to style, right above up here, we're going to scroll up. I try to do this kind of towards the top. So we have our H1's body. So right after body, I'm going to add the image tag. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use something like max width 100%. What this does is it allows the image to be able to resize to whatever max width that we have, that image is holding to that container. So for example, if this image was very, 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 very small, let me see if I can find a very small image. Let's see this image over here. Image, this is 256 pixels by 256 pixels. I'm going to right click and then say something like copy link address. Take a look at this. If we go back here and I refresh this and paste that in there, when I go to my browser and I refresh, notice that this free creative stuff does not grow to the size of its parent container. And that's because this free creative stuff is only growing as much as it's allowed, which in our case is 256 pixels wide by 256 pixels high. But if we wanted to make sure that all of our images, we create maybe larger images and these images, wanted to refit that specific space, then we can add the max width again, and it allows for all of our images to kind of resize up to whatever max width it has. This one, if I am not mistaken, let's take a look at this. This one is actually 4,866 pixels by 3,647 pixels. Huge image. We probably will never use something like this in a production website. Again, this is just for testing purposes. Once we actually go into images and things like that, then I'll I'll explain that a little bit better, and then we're going to be able to create some responsive images and how they get displayed on the side, etc., etc. It's going to be really good. Just take my word for it. Just you learn right now image, the image tag, and some other tags today. But again, we're going to learn more about images in the future. So let's go back here. Let's go ahead and add this image tag right here. So let's go ahead and do the following. Now we have a title. Let's go ahead and do that as an H2, for example, and description of circuit. And then here, let's go ahead and add a paragraph. And conveniently, I have lorem ipsum open. Just paste it in there. And if we go to the site, now we have our description. We have a little paragraph right there. Let me go ahead and minimize the size. See, okay, that's as small as it gets. All right, so we have this here. Maybe what I want to do is I want this image for, say, my desktop. Let's go ahead and go over here and go all the way to the bottom. And in this case, we're going to do our child one. Let's go ahead and make it 50% because I want it bigger. All right. So now I want it for my desktop to show, right, in the following order. So let's go ahead and we can do child one image, if I'm not mistaken. Let's take a look at this. Okay, actually I called it a class of image. And then here, child one title, child one description. Right? Now, what would happen if I do something like order one in here in the image? Let's take a look. Refresh it. Wait a minute. Isn't it 0 to 1? So that image should actually be at the very bottom. Yes, but the problem is that we don't have a parent designation for this child one. Remember, it's only parent to child or container to item rather than grandchildren. So if we wanted this child one to also be able to use Flexbox, then let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and make it a flex element. So we can use display, flex, and look at what's going to happen. Again, we have child 2 and 3 here. If we refresh, right there, we set it up as display flex. All right. Now the next thing that we're going to do is flex flow. Again, based on what we're looking at here, we usually have it as, right, row, right? So we want it to maybe be column because we wanted the elements to be from top to bottom. So let's go ahead and change that to column. And we do want the elements to wrap, so we can do wrap. And now because we have set it up as a flex parent, now this image is responding to what position we can set it up on. Now, another thing to keep in mind, remember, we don't have a specific width for each one of these elements right here. So we could also do something like row wrap because they're all expending 100%. So again, you have 100%, 100%, 100% here. All right. Now, we have the child image, right? And we have that order of 1. We can also make sure that we align our items. So we have align items, and then let's do flex start, align content, flex start, and justify content, flex start. Now, this may seem like an overkill, but every time that I use Flexbox, I try to make sure that I use all of the references that I have available for the parent. The child, I may not necessarily add any styles like flex or anything like that, but for the parent, I try to use them all of the time. Now check this out. We can also do here something like flex, and we want it to grow, say maybe 1, and want it to shrink 1, and we want our default value to be something like maybe 30%. See, for our title, and then we can do flex, and then here we want it to grow maybe like 4 times, but we want it also to shrink only 1, and then here we're going to do the other 70%. If we change this, hold on a second. Description is 70%. Let's go ahead and change that to 60%. There we go. So now take a look at this. What we did, again, we set up the description to kind of be on the left, and then we have the paragraph on the right. And because we're allowing this to grow, then they're kind of touching each other. If we didn't want that to happen, we can also do something like 0, 0. We don't want them to grow. We want them to keep static at 30% and 60%. Now you have that space right there. And again, you have that space in between. We can also do justify content here and do space between. There you go. And there's a little more separation. And to change, let's change this to a smaller heading. Let me see if I can zoom out. I cannot zoom out. Okay, there you go. That looks a little bit better. So now we have the element right here and the element over here. Now these two are kind of not aligned to each other. So let's go ahead and see if we can fix that. We can go into align items, and then we can do baseline. And now you see the baseline of this element is the same baseline of this element here. So they look a little bit more in proportion with each other. And then again, you still have the image on the bottom as well. Maybe later on when we start learning how to use media queries to be able to change elements from desktop to mobile to tablet, then we'll be able to explore this a little bit more. So again, maybe for our mobile, then I do want the image to be on the very top. And again, you can change how elements are laid out. And this is a really quick way to kind of be able to, work on layouts and work on components. So this will be considered like a small component, really using very simple lines of code. If you look at here, I only used these many lines of code here to create this complex component without having to really do math and do spacing and kind of trying to figure things out like that. So again, very, very, very interesting. I would suggest, again, play with it, make changes to your Flexbox learning file. Try to maybe create different, look at what some of the websites that you like and see if you can try to copy some of their styles in these independent styles that you're looking in or using Flexbox, sorry. So again, remember, parent-children relationship with Flexbox. If you wanted these two to be considered as one single unit, like the description, title, and the description, the title and the description, then maybe you will have to wrap that, in a div class of content, right? And by doing that, then now again, we look back here, we refresh. What happened? Remember, we have parent, children. The only children are image and content. This title and description no longer is a factor or being affected by the Flexbox that we set up on the child-1 selector. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind, play with it. If you have questions, leave it on the comment below, and I'm going to later on try to create some exercise files where you can play with all the different Flexbox values and maybe give you some layouts that I'm going to create using using like something like XD, and that way you can try to mimic how you'll be able to move those boxes to create that specific file or that specific component. So we'll look at that in just a little bit. The next video that I'm going to create is going to be our grid system that we're going to be using for our website, and in that grid system we're going to use the media queries that I talked about a little bit earlier on, but again we're just going to focus on that video. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, anything about Flexbox, let me know. I will have the descriptions for you on or the links to the different articles in the description below. And if you have access to another tool, so like for example LinkedIn Learning or something like that, feel free to take other classes to kind of expand that knowledge on Flexbox. Try to look at different examples, and most important of all, practice, practice, practice. If you don't practice, you won't be able to get a hang of this knowledge. And right now it's very foreign. You're just learning, but trust me, the more that you do it, the more intuitive it becomes, and the easier and easier it becomes to create layouts. So I hope to see you in the next video where we're going to create our grid system. In the meanwhile, if you have questions, you know what to do. Have a good day. Bye.